we will learn how to identify Hebrew verbs, nouns, and relative particles through Hebrew sentences. We will practice with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The first word is Bereshit. Last time, we learned that there are verbs, nouns, and relative particles. We learned that there is the perfect form and the imperfect form to indicative verbs. We also added adjectives to nouns. We also briefly mentioned that there are pronouns. Relative particles include prepositions, articles, conjunctions, relative pronouns, infinitives, adverbs, emphatic particles, among others. Using these, let's take apart the word Bereshit in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Be, at the very beginning, can be seen as a preposition. It is a relative particle and is also a preposition. In English, it can be interpreted as in, by, or with. Next, Reshit. This part is a proper noun meaning beginning. Hence, the preposition and the noun come together to mean in the beginning or beginning. The word that comes after Bereshit in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is bara. Bara is a verb. it is a verb in the perfect form. We studied the perfect form. We learned that a word with the person, gender, and number of a perfect form that is without a prefix or suffix is in the third person masculine singular form. Therefore, any word that is made up of these three basic consonants is a Hebrew verb in the perfect form, which is the third person masculine singular. If a suffix was added to such a word, we would be able to determine if it was a perfect form of an indicative Hebrew verb. Do you remember the endings of the indicative perfect form of Hebrew verbs we studied last time? Blank, a, ta, ti, u, tem, ten, nu. If a word was in an imperfect form, a prefix would be added, or the word would have both a prefix or a suffix. We studied in the last lecture how to memorize prefixes and suffixes of the imperfect form of indicative Hebrew verbs. Please memorize E, T, T-E, Aleph, E, I-U, T-Na, T-U, T-Na, Ni. Memorize the prefixes and suffixes that determine the person, gender, and number of imperfect and perfect forms of indicative Hebrew verbs. Next, let's look at the third word in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, Elohim. This word means God. This is a proper noun. This is a Hebrew proper noun, and it means God. The next word is E. Aleph is a consonant, but it is a silent syllable and is not pronounced. Instead, there is chere. Because there is the e and tau, it produces a T sound and is translated as et. This is the objective postposition in Hebrew. There is no separate objective postposition in English. However, in Hebrew and Korean, there is the objective postposition, and with it, we can know that the following word is objective. Next, hashamayim. First, we have the word ha, and ha is an article. We call this the definite article. In English, it would be the word the. Next, the proper noun shamayim. A proper noun is a noun with a specific name. Therefore, this is translated as the heaven. There is also the form im, which can be translated as heavens. Next, be'et. We can first separate this into be and et. Be is a conjunction. It is a conjunction under relative particles. This conjunction is and in English. It can also mean but. Next, there is the objective postposition et. Hence, when we combine these and interpret it, it would be and something. The next word would have an objective postposition. The next word is haaretz. Haaretz. We can first separate this into ha and aretz. Ha is the definite article. Aretz is the noun. It means the earth. In this way, we must be able to identify words in sentences. We must recognize words in sentences as verbs, nouns, or relative particles. Then we must be able to recognize the perfect form and the imperfect form of verbs. Then we must be able to determine whether a noun is a noun, an adjective, or a pronoun. We must also be able to identify prepositions, articles, conjunctions, relative pronouns, infinitives, and adverbs of relative particles. Now let's study Hebrew verbs. First, we will briefly go over the system of Hebrew verbs. We studied two parts of the Hebrew verb system. They are the perfect form and the imperfect form. The perfect form indicates the completion of an action at a certain point of time in the past, present, or future. There is also the imperfect form. The imperfect form indicates the incompletion of an action at a certain point of time in the past, present, or future. These two forms are called the indicative in Hebrew. The indicative is distinct from the imperative. The indicative is a mood of verbs concerning a simple action. On the other hand, the imperative is a mood of verbs expressing a specific command or exhortation. There are three kinds of the imperative. First is the second person imperative, which we are most familiar with. This is the imperative. There is also the third person and first person imperative, which we are less familiar with. The third person and first person imperative strictly refer to exhortations or duties. The third person imperative is the jussive in English. The first person imperative is cohortative in English. We know the general idea of the perfect and imperfect forms because we studied them. These two are called finite verbs in Hebrew. Finite verbs indicate verbs with a person, gender, and number. Therefore, all verbs of the indicative and the imperative are finite verbs with a person, gender, and number. Hebrew verbs that are of the perfect form, the imperfect form, the third person imperative, the first person imperative, and the second person imperative all have a person, gender, and number. On the contrary, there are non-finite verbs. These are verbs, but they do not have a person, gender, or number. Let's reorganize the non-finite verbs on the board. Non-finite verbs are separated into two main kinds. First is the participle. Second is the infinitive. The participle is a part of speech that has the same nature as that of nouns and verbs. It has the character of nouns, and it also has the character of verbs. It is one word that has different forms. The infinitive is a part of speech used for specific purposes. This is commonly used adverbially. The participle is also separated into two: the active participle and the passive participle. The infinitive is separated into the absolute state and the construct state. The absolute state is a name given to a specific character that is not combined with anything else. This is used independently. However, the construct state is given its name because of its character in which it is combined with other parts of speech. This is a map of Hebrew verbs. There are finite verbs and non-finite verbs. Finite verbs are separated into the indicative and imperative. The indicative includes the perfect form and the imperfect form. The imperative includes the first, second, and third person imperatives. Non-finite verbs include the participle and the infinitive. The participle includes the active participle and the passive participle. The infinitive is separated into the absolute and the construct states. Now let's review the perfect form and the imperfect form of Hebrew verbs. Last time we briefly studied the perfect and imperfect forms of the Hebrew indicative. Let's write the forms here on the board. Let's review the forms. The verb malak. Malak is a third person masculine singular. According to the different verb forms we learned, this verb is a third person masculine singular or the indicative perfect form. Hence, whatever word you see in the future, you must be able to identify it. Furthermore, we can put a mark that shows that a word is a verb. When we see a Hebrew word, we must be able to know what category the word falls in, if it is a noun, a verb, or a relative particle. If the word is a verb, we must identify whether it is a finite verb or a non-finite verb. If it is a finite verb, we must determine whether it is in the indicative mood or the imperative mood. Malak is in the indicative mood. Next, we must determine whether it is in the perfect form or the imperfect form. Next, we must identify the person, gender, and number of the verb in the perfect form. Then, lastly, we must translate the word. It means he ruled. This is how we can identify Hebrew verbs. The interpretation of Hebrew verbs and nouns is called morphological analysis. Morphological analysis. You must analyze Hebrew words in this way from now on. Let's look at the third person feminine singular form of the Hebrew word malak. An ending is added to malak. The ending kap is not a specific form of ending, but is kap, which can be found at the beginning or middle of words. The third person feminine singular of the indicative perfect form of Hebrew verbs. Only the gender changes and the form changes because a is added to the beginning. 말카. Comets is at the beginning. When you change words in this way, when we write the basic words in the same way, ta, t, ti, u. Ta, t, ti, u. Let's write this one more time here. U, and then tem. Next, ten. Then nu. Rewrite them like this. This is the third person singular of the indicative perfect form of Hebrew verbs to the first person common plural form. Now let's look at the imperfect form. Likewise, we will begin with the third person masculine singular. We will use the verb malak. First, the prefix is added, and then the vowel change. It would become imlok. Here and here are the important parts. When it changes in this way, T is put at the front. T is placed here as well. T is placed here, and E is put here as well. Next, we put Aleph and add the vowel shewa. The same consonants are put together and the vowel changes. We will look into this in depth in the future. Next, the plural form. The prefix e is added and the suffix u is added. Next, the prefix t is added. Then the suffix na is added to the basic consonant. Next, the prefix t is added. The suffix u is added to the basic consonant. Next, the basic consonants are added to the prefix t, and then na is added to it. Next, the prefix ni is added, and then the basic consonants are added as well. Then we will see that this is a third-person masculine singular verb in the indicative perfect form. Next, the third-person singular verb in the indicative imperfect form. Next, the second-person masculine singular verb in the indicative imperfect form. Next, the second-person feminine singular verb in the indicative imperfect form. Next, the first-person common singular verb in the indicative imperfect form. Next, the third-person masculine plural verb of the third-person indicative imperfect form. Next, the third-person feminine plural verb of the third-person indicative imperfect form. Next, the third and second-person masculine plural verb of the indicative imperfect form. Next, the second-person feminine plural verb of the indicative imperfect form. Lastly, the first-person common plural form of the indicative imperfect form of verbs. You must remember the prefix and suffix changes in order to identify the person, gender, and number of all verbs in the indicative imperfect form. Please read along. E, T, 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 Aleph, E. E, U, T, Na, T, U, T, Na, Ni, Ni. You must memorize these. These are all forms of Hebrew verbs. There is one more thing you must know. The different Hebrew verb forms are connected to the call stem. The call stem in the Hebrew language is a verb with a simple active voice. For example, Malak is he ruled in the past tense, but its meaning is in a simple active voice. The call stem has a simple active voice. Again, Malak, which means he ruled in the past tense. This has a simple active voice. This is the perfect form and imperfect form, the first person imperative, the second person imperative, the third person imperative, the participle active, the participle passive, the infinitive absolute, and the infinitive construct. The simple active voice of the Hebrew language can be used to identify other meanings. There is also a form with a simple passive voice. This is called the nifl stem in Hebrew grammar. If Malak was he ruled, then it would be he was ruled in the nifl system. In Hebrew, it would become nimlak when nun is added. It means he was ruled. There is another stem called the simple intensive. This is called the piel stem in Hebrew grammar. The piel stem has a simple, intensive voice. It's the active, intensive voice. There is also something called the pual system. This is a passive, intensive voice. It can be interpreted as he was ruled thoroughly or brutally, and this intensifies a meaning. There is a difference between the knifeful stem and the puol stem. The knifeful stem means he was ruled, and the puol stem means he was ruled thoroughly or brutally. There is also the intensive, reflexive voice. This is called the hifpael stem. This is an action that impacts oneself. It would mean he thoroughly ruled himself. There are two forms that express causative action. Let's write them over here. There is the hifil stem. This would be a causative action with an active voice. This does not refer to oneself, but refers to an action that impacts others. Thus, the verb malak would mean that he made someone rule. Next, there is a causative passive voice, the hopeful system. This refers to a causative action with a passive voice. The causative passive means that he made someone be ruled. These are the 7 kinds of forms. Each of these forms are different verb forms that are used in the same way as the call stem is used. Hence, the call stem, the knifeful stem, the piel stem, the puol stem, the hifpael stem, the hifil stem, and the hopeful stem have the simple active voice, the simple passive voice, the intensive active voice, the intensive passive voice, the intensive reflexive voice, the causative active voice, and the causative passive voice, respectively. These all have the perfect form or the imperfect form. They do not only have the indicative perfect or imperfect form, but also have the imperative form. They also have participles and infinitives. We must be able to clearly understand these complex rules. Thank you.